Hey guys. Settle here. Tonight we are going to start the most dangerous thing in medieval Europe was dinner. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The most dangerous thing in medieval Europe was not war. Not plague. Not invasion. It was dinner. Not because the food was poisonous. Most of the time, it wasn't. Not because it was rare. Most people ate something every day, even if that something was thin, gray, and emotionally unambitious. Dinner was dangerous because it worked. It warmed cold hands. It quieted hunger. It softened long days of labor. And occasionally, and this was the real problem, it made people feel good. And medieval society did not trust things that made people feel good. So tonight, as the fire burns low and the wind presses quietly against the shutters, we begin not in a battlefield, but at a wooden table. The table is uneven. The benches are hard. The bowl is chipped. The bread is dense enough to qualify as construction material. And yet, someone at that table is smiling. That smile is the problem. Because in the medieval imagination, the body and the soul were not partners. They were rivals. The soul wanted eternity. The body wanted stew. The soul wanted discipline. The body wanted warmth. The soul dreamed of heaven. The body was very interested in seconds. And dinner was the daily battleground where this disagreement played out. You see, medieval people did not separate morality from appetite. Eating was not just biological. It was spiritual performance. Every bite asked a question. Are you eating because you must? Or because you want to? That distinction mattered more than the portion size. Gluttony, as medieval thinkers described it, was not the cartoon image of someone collapsing under excess. It was subtler. More exhausting. Gluttony could happen in 5 ways. Eating too soon. Eating too expensively. Eating too eagerly. Eating too much. Or thinking about food too fondly before it arrived. Yes, anticipation could be sinful. Imagine that for a moment. You wake before dawn. You work in fields or workshops. You carry water. You mend tools. You endure cold wind and damp stone walls. And somewhere in your thoughts, you look forward to the evening meal. That small flicker of anticipation. Suspicious. Because desire itself was risky. Medieval theology operated on a simple assumption: the body, left unchecked, would always demand more than it deserved. More warmth. More rest. More comfort. More flavor. And flavor was dangerous because it bypassed reason. You did not reason your way into enjoying warm bread. You simply enjoyed it. The pleasure arrived before you could supervise it. Pleasure without supervision was alarming. So restraint became visible theater. You were meant to eat slowly. Not because you were savoring. Savoring implied appreciation. Appreciation implied attachment. No, you ate slowly to demonstrate control. You paused between bites, not to enjoy the texture, but to prove you could stop if necessary. Even if you could not. Especially if you could not. The ideal medieval diner looked faintly disappointed at all times. Not miserable, misery could become dramatic. But mildly detached. As though the stew was adequate but spiritually uninteresting. Commenting that the food was very good today bordered on recklessness. Smiling while chewing. Bold. Closing your eyes in satisfaction. Nearly theatrical rebellion. And yet the irony was this: medieval food was often bland. Grains. Roots. Cabbage. Salted fish. Dark bread dense enough to require commitment. But the less exciting the food was, the more morally impressive it was not to enjoy it. The goal was not starvation. Starvation was involuntary and therefore spiritually unremarkable. The goal was controlled hunger. To eat just enough to survive, but not enough to feel triumphant about it. Because triumph belonged to saints and martyrs, not to peasants with porridge. Now consider meat. Meat was efficient. It restored strength quickly. It satisfied deeply. And anything that satisfied deeply was immediately suspect. Red meat, especially, was believed to heat the blood. Heated blood led to heated emotions. Heated emotions led to impulsive decisions. Impulsive decisions led to sermons. So the church calendar filled itself with restrictions. Fridays, no meat. Lent, no meat. Vigils, no meat. Saints' days, often no meat. It sometimes felt easier to list the days when meat was allowed. And yet, when it was allowed, it arrived like a minor festival. Roasted. Salted. Occasionally spiced. The smell alone could make the room quieter. Which was precisely the problem. Because smell stirred anticipation. And anticipation stirred desire. And desire required monitoring. So you might sit there, holding a wooden knife, pretending not to be impressed while everyone collectively ignored how good the room suddenly felt. If you chewed too quickly, someone might notice. If you reached first, that would be remembered. If you asked for more before others had finished, that bordered on moral exhibitionism. The rule was simple: eat, but appear unenthusiastic. And this tension did something peculiar. It made food more powerful. Because when you're told something is morally risky, your mind clings to it harder. A slice of pork was no longer protein. It was temptation with gravy. A wedge of cheese was not dairy. It was emotional comfort disguised as agriculture. And cheese was another quiet scandal. Cheese lingered. It did not overwhelm. It soothed. You could sit with cheese. Think with cheese. Reflect with cheese. That was dangerous. Lingering implied attachment. Attachment implied preference. Preference implied self-indulgence. Monasteries often restricted cheese, except for illness. Interestingly, monastic illness rates increased suspiciously around supper. Officially, cheese was medicinal. Unofficially, it was excellent. And then there were eggs. Small. Humble. Almost innocent. Eggs caused disproportionate anxiety. They were filling. Convenient. Versatile. They could be boiled quickly. Mixed into dishes. Hidden in sauces. Which meant they could slip into meals without announcement. Sin, ideally, should be obvious. Eggs were subtle. Different regions argued endlessly about whether eggs counted as meat during fasting. The debates were intense. Not because eggs were dramatic. But because they were easy. And ease was always suspicious. Ease implied comfort. Comfort implied complacency. Complacency implied spiritual decline. So imagine worrying not about war, but about whether the omelette has compromised your soul. This was not satire. This was lived reality. Even sweetness carried risk. Sugar, when it arrived from distant trade routes, was rare and dazzling. It was joy in crystalline form. Refined sweetness suggested refined indulgence. Honey was tolerated. It came from nature. It required labor. It felt honest. Sugar felt luxurious. Luxurious things required justification. So sweets were saved for feast days. Joy was permitted, but scheduled. Spontaneous joy was harder to defend. White bread carried its own controversy. Soft. Pale. Carefully sifted. It required resources to produce. Dark bread was heavy, coarse, honest. White bread was smooth, comfortable. Eating white bread regularly suggested you preferred ease over endurance. And endurance was the medieval virtue of choice. If your bread did not challenge you slightly, what else in your life was too easy? You see the pattern. Food was not judged by taste alone. It was judged by what it symbolized. Did it build character? Or did it encourage comfort? Because comfort was slippery. Comfort might lead to laziness. Laziness might lead to distraction. Distraction might lead to forgetting eternal priorities. And all of that could begin with a particularly pleasant dinner. Now pause for a moment and imagine living under this system. Not starving. Not feasting. But constantly monitoring your enthusiasm. Every meal is a tiny examination. Are you chewing too eagerly? Are you enjoying the texture too much? Did you think about dinner before it arrived? Did you feel relief when hunger ended? Relief was acceptable. Happiness was more complicated. And yet, and this is important, medieval people still laughed at tables. They still traded food. They still celebrated harvests. They were not joyless. They were careful. Joy had to be framed properly. It had to be communal. It had to be justified. And ideally, it had to include at least a small note of restraint. Because restraint proved that the soul was still in charge. Or at least pretending to be. And so dinner remained both necessity and negotiation. A daily conversation between hunger and holiness. Between appetite and eternity. Between warmth and warning. The bowl sits before you. Steam rises. The room smells faintly of herbs and wood smoke. You are tired. You are hungry. You take a bite. And somewhere in the quiet background of your mind, a voice asks. Are you enjoying this too much? And that, more than war, more than plague, is why dinner was dangerous. And so the danger did not end when the bowl was empty. If anything, that was when the second phase began. Because fullness required interpretation. Hunger was simple. Hunger was honest. Hunger reminded you that you were human, dependent, unfinished. Hunger could be offered up to God like a small daily sacrifice. Hunger had purpose. Fullness, however, was ambiguous. Fullness could be gratitude. Or it could be indulgence. It could be the body quietly celebrating victory over restraint. And in a world that distrusted bodily victories, that was unsettling. So after the meal, there was often silence. Not dramatic silence. Just a subtle shift. The clatter softened. Movement slowed. People leaned back slightly but not too much. Leaning back too much suggested satisfaction. Satisfaction suggested completion. Completion suggested contentment. And contentment was spiritually risky. You were not meant to feel finished in this world. This was not the final home. This was the testing ground. The training field. The corridor before eternity. If dinner made you feel settled, comfortable, complete, it blurred that understanding. So medieval life developed rhythms designed to interrupt comfort. Feast and fast. Plenty and restraint. Celebration and correction. The calendar was less a schedule and more a moral heartbeat. Feasts existed, yes. Loud, joyful, excessive in ways that might surprise modern assumptions. Tables groaned under roasted meats, pies, thick breads, sweet cakes soaked in honey or spice. Wine flowed. Laughter grew louder than usual. Even clergy participated. But feast days were framed carefully. They were not spontaneous joy. They were authorized joy. And authorized joy is very different from private enjoyment. On a feast day, pleasure was communal. Structured. Liturgical. It had context. It belonged to everyone. No one person was indulging alone. The joy was shared, which made it safer. But the day after the feast was often quieter. Quieter in tone. Quieter in appetite. Because excess, even when allowed, had to be followed by correction. The medieval mind liked balance, but not in a modern wellness sense. Balance meant tension. A pendulum that never rested. If yesterday was abundant, today should be restrained. If yesterday was rich, today should be plain. If yesterday felt easy, today must feel intentional. And nowhere was this clearer than in fasting. Fasting was not starvation. It was structured reduction. Less meat. Less dairy. Fewer courses. Simpler preparation. But more importantly, more awareness. Fasting sharpened the edges of hunger. It reminded you that desire was always waiting beneath the surface. It made appetite visible again. And visibility mattered. Because the true fear was not hunger. The true fear was unconscious indulgence. If you enjoyed something without noticing, that was worse than enjoying it openly. So fasting functioned like a moral reset. It reintroduced discomfort in manageable doses. It said to the body, gently but firmly, you are not in charge. But the body never truly surrendered. It negotiated. During Lent, for example, when meat, dairy, and eggs were often restricted, creativity flourished. Almond milk replaced cow's milk. Elaborate fish dishes appeared in noble households. Vegetable pies grew increasingly complex. Spices compensated for missing richness. Technically compliant. Spiritually debatable. Everyone knew what was happening. The letter of the law was being honored. The spirit was being gently bent. And this bending was not rebellion. It was human. Medieval cooks were not villains in a morality play. They were practical. They lived in cold climates. They worked long hours. They understood morale. A good meal could lift a room. It could restore patience. It could soften arguments. And in households where labor was constant and leisure rare, that mattered. Which created an uncomfortable truth. Food did not only threaten morality. It supported survival. It kept communities stable. It prevented resentment. A well-fed peasant was more likely to work steadily. A well-fed monk was more likely to copy manuscripts without complaint. A well-fed noble was less likely to make impulsive political decisions based on irritability. Hunger sharpened tempers. So even while sermons warned against indulgence, kitchens quietly ensured sustainability. This tension created one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval food culture. The performance of modesty. At noble tables, for example, multiple courses were common. Roasted meats, sauces thick with spice, breads in varying textures, pies filled with layers of surprise. But nobles rarely described themselves as indulgent. Instead, they framed meals as hospitality. To refuse abundance would insult guests. To serve lavishly demonstrated generosity. And generosity was virtuous. So the same table that could symbolize gluttony in one context became charity in another. Intent mattered. But intent was difficult to measure. Which is why visibility mattered more. If a noble hosted a feast for many, the excess was shared and therefore safer. If that same noble ate alone in private luxury, questions arose. Solitary pleasure was always more dangerous than communal pleasure. In monasteries, the dynamic was even more delicate. Monks took vows of simplicity, poverty, discipline. Their meals reflected this. Often plain, measured, repetitive. But monasteries also owned land, produced wine, raised fish, made cheese. The quality could be surprisingly high. And monks were human. They appreciated well-made bread, a well-aged cheese, a carefully brewed ale. So rules developed. Portions were regulated. Silence was often maintained during meals. A text might be read aloud while eating, redirecting attention from taste to theology. If you were listening to scripture, you were less likely to focus on the butter. In theory. But even in silence, the senses operated. Steam still rose. Crust still cracked. Flavor still arrived. And monks, like everyone else, had to navigate the quiet negotiation between gratitude and attachment. Confession played a role here. Gluttony was a recognized sin, but its definition was nuanced. Confessors might ask, did you eat before the proper time? Did you seek out particularly luxurious foods? Did you complain about simple fare? Did you take more than your share? Notice what is absent from that list. There is no measurement in calories. No weighing of plates. The focus is relational and emotional. Timing. Preference. Attitude. Sharing. Medieval morality was less concerned with the size of your meal and more concerned with the posture of your heart while eating it. Which made dinner psychologically complex. Because you could not simply measure your virtue by quantity. You had to evaluate your enthusiasm. And enthusiasm is slippery. You might sit at table determined to remain detached. Then the stew is slightly better than expected. The herbs are balanced. The bread is warm. And suddenly you feel something like gratitude mixed with relief. Is that safe? Is that too much? Should you slow down? Should you leave a small portion unfinished to demonstrate restraint? Some people did exactly that. Leaving a bite behind became a subtle symbol. Not full. Not attached. Still capable of denial. But even that gesture could become pride. Look how restrained I am. Which meant the performance of modesty itself required monitoring. You see how the cycle deepens. Food was never just food. It was mirror, measure, metaphor. Now consider peasants, who lived closer to subsistence. Their meals were simpler, yes. But the same moral logic applied. Dark bread. Pottage made from grains and vegetables. Occasional bits of meat when available. Ale diluted with water. Their danger was not excess, but longing. Longing for what they did not regularly have. Longing for white bread. For roasted meats. For sweets. Longing itself could be framed as covetousness. Desiring what belonged to a higher class risked envy. So even imagination around food had boundaries. And yet markets existed. Festivals allowed indulgence. Travelers described foreign cuisines with fascination. Trade routes brought spices that transformed humble dishes. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves. Small amounts, used carefully. Spices did more than flavor food. They signaled reach. Connection to distant lands. Access to trade networks. Which made them luxurious. And luxury required moral framing. Spices were often justified as medicinal. They aided digestion. Balanced humors. Improved health. Which meant their pleasure could be explained. Explanation softened suspicion. That pattern repeats constantly in medieval food culture. If something tasted good, it needed a reason. Medicinal. Hospitality. Feast day. Illness. Guest honor. Rarely was pleasure allowed to stand alone. Because pleasure standing alone looked like rebellion. And rebellion did not begin with swords. It began with preference. Preference is powerful. When you begin choosing what you like over what you are given, you assert autonomy. Medieval society was structured around hierarchy and order. Autonomy had limits. So the table became a place where hierarchy was rehearsed daily. Who sits where? Who is served first? Who receives the best cut? Who waits? Food distribution reflected social order. And enjoying what was above your station could appear disruptive. If a servant expressed too much delight in a noble's dish, it blurred lines. If a noble praised peasant food excessively, it could be read as eccentric or performative. Everything had context. Even hunger had hierarchy. Now imagine winter. Cold seeping through stone walls. Stores running low. Salted meats dwindling. Grain carefully rationed. In these months, the danger shifted. Scarcity made enjoyment rare. And rare enjoyment more intense. A single preserved apple. A bit of honey saved for weeks. A small wedge of cheese. In scarcity, flavor sharpens. Which makes the moment heavier. More charged. And perhaps more spiritually complicated. Because when pleasure is rare, it feels more vivid. More unforgettable. Which means attachment grows stronger. And so the quiet tension returns. Can you be grateful without clinging? Can you enjoy without demanding repetition? Can you taste without longing for tomorrow's portion? These were not always articulated questions. But they lived beneath the surface. Under every bite. Under every swallow. Dinner, then, was not just sustenance. It was rehearsal. For restraint. For hierarchy. For obedience. For gratitude. For self-monitoring. And yet, despite all this structure, medieval tables were not joyless prisons. They were lively. Children laughed. Stories were told. Travelers shared news. Neighbors exchanged gossip. Bread was broken and passed. There was warmth. There was humor. There was humanity. Which makes the whole system more interesting. Because medieval people were not crushed by guilt at every meal. They simply lived with awareness. An awareness that appetite mattered. That desire had direction. That the body was strong. And that strength required guidance. Dinner was dangerous not because it destroyed society. But because it revealed it. It revealed who had power. Who had access. Who had discipline. Who had desire. And who, in a quiet moment, closed their eyes for just a second too long while chewing. And if the table inside the home was a quiet stage for discipline, the tavern was something else entirely. Not lawless. Not chaotic in the way we sometimes imagine. But looser. Warmer. Louder. The tavern sat at the edge of moral comfort. Ale flowed there more freely than in monasteries. Laughter rose without immediate correction. Stories stretched longer than necessary. Portions sometimes grew generous. And generosity, in the right setting, could slip toward indulgence. Taverns were not condemned outright. They served a purpose. Travelers needed shelter. Laborers needed rest. Communities needed gathering spaces. But sermons frequently circled them like cautious birds. Because the tavern combined two risky elements, food and company. Food alone could tempt the body. Company could amplify it. Laughter encourages seconds. Conversation slows restraint. A shared jug empties faster than a private cup. The concern was not simply that people would eat too much. It was that they would forget to monitor themselves while doing it. Noise dulls self-awareness. Music softens inhibition. And medieval moral thought relied heavily on conscious self-supervision. In the tavern, self-supervision sometimes relaxed. Which made the space symbolically charged. It was a place where hierarchy blurred slightly. Where peasants and tradesmen shared tables. Where travelers brought unfamiliar spices and stories. Where food from different regions mixed. And mixing was both exciting and unsettling. New tastes expand expectation. Expectation expands desire. Desire complicates obedience. So taverns lived in a gray zone. Necessary but watched. Enjoyed but warned against. A place where dinner could quietly grow teeth. Now move from the tavern to the castle hall. Long tables. Torches flickering. Servants moving in practiced rhythm. Platters carried high. Roasted animals displayed almost theatrically. Here, food was spectacle. Not merely eaten, but presented. Presentation mattered because power mattered. To display abundance was to display stability. A lord who fed many appeared strong. But here again, morality whispered. Excess without generosity looked tyrannical. Excess shared looked noble. So feasting became political theater. The lord carved meat publicly, distributing portions in visible hierarchy. The best cuts went to honored guests. Lesser cuts to others. Bread circulated according to rank. Eating reinforced structure. And structure reassured society. But even in this grandeur, the same spiritual tension remained. A noble who visibly reveled in excess risked criticism. A noble who appeared indifferent to abundance signaled discipline. So even amid multiple courses, performance of restraint survived. Small bites. Measured praise. Moderate drinking. Public generosity paired with personal composure. Because gluttony, at its core, was about losing control. And control was currency. Now shift again, this time to famine. Because no discussion of medieval food morality is complete without acknowledging scarcity. There were years when crops failed. When rain came too much or not enough. When grain stores thinned dangerously. When bread grew smaller, darker, stretched with substitutes. In famine, the moral tone altered. When survival itself trembled, indulgence was no longer the concern. Desperation was. People ate what they could. Bark mixed into flour. Thin soups extended beyond reason. Foraged roots. Anything edible. In these moments, the fear was not gluttony but theft. Hoarding. Breaking social trust. Famine revealed another side of appetite. When hunger sharpened beyond comfort, it could erode restraint entirely. The same society that worried about enthusiasm during abundance now feared collapse during scarcity. Which shows something important. The medieval suspicion of pleasure was not random cruelty. It was preventative. A society accustomed to moderation might withstand scarcity better. A society trained to endure mild hunger might adapt more calmly when hunger grew severe. Restraint was not only spiritual. It was practical insurance. Still, famine left scars. Psychological ones. Those who lived through prolonged scarcity often developed complicated relationships with food. Relief at abundance mixed with anxiety about its loss. Which intensified the tension around enjoyment. If plenty could vanish next winter, attachment felt risky. Better not to cling too tightly. Better to practice small denials even when food was available. Now consider the role of women in this landscape. Women, especially in peasant and urban households, were often responsible for preparing meals. They stood at the intersection of necessity and morality. They stretched ingredients. Balanced flavors. Managed stores. They knew how much grain remained. How much salt. How much dried fish could last through winter. Their task was not only culinary. It was ethical. A household's reputation could hinge on how it ate. Too lavish, and neighbors whispered about pride. Too sparse when guests arrived, and whispers shifted to stinginess. Meals communicated character. And the cook, often a woman, shaped that message. She decided how rich a stew would be. How thin to slice the bread. Whether to use the last bit of honey today or save it. These were practical decisions with moral undertones. Because food signaled discipline. And discipline signaled virtue. In noble households, kitchen staff operated under even closer scrutiny. The steward monitored supplies. The cook followed instructions aligned with the liturgical calendar. Servants observed hierarchy through food distribution. The kitchen was both engine and boundary. It kept hunger at bay while ensuring excess did not erode order. Now let us return to the monastery for a moment. Monastic life was built around rhythm. Prayer, work, study, meal. Meals were often eaten in silence while scripture was read aloud. This practice did something fascinating. It redirected sensory focus. If the mind was occupied with sacred text, taste became secondary. Food was fuel for devotion, not the center of attention. At least ideally. But the senses do not disappear simply because words fill the air. Bread still breaks with a specific sound. Soup still warms the throat. Ale still carries weight. So monks developed interior discipline. They learned to notice pleasure without chasing it. To register satisfaction without celebrating it. This interior negotiation shaped medieval spirituality profoundly. It trained attention. It made appetite visible. It cultivated awareness of subtle desire. Which leads to an important realization. Medieval food anxiety was not merely repression. It was introspection. They believed desire revealed something about the soul. And food was the most consistent daily desire. So dinner became diagnostic. A mirror held up nightly. Not to shame, but to examine. Where does your heart lean? Toward comfort. Toward control. Toward gratitude. Toward greed. Now widen the lens. Across Europe, climates differed. Crops varied. Fish dominated in coastal regions. Grain shaped inland diets. Olive oil in the south. Butter in the north. Yet the moral language around food remained surprisingly consistent. Heat and cold. Moist and dry. Balance of humors. Too much heat inflamed passion. Too much moisture dulled clarity. Diet influenced temperament. So eating was also about maintaining psychological equilibrium. Food shaped mood. Mood shaped behavior. Behavior shaped salvation. It was a logical chain, within their worldview. Which meant that dinner was never trivial. It influenced not just the body, but the social fabric. Even modern habits echo this inheritance. We still speak of comfort food. We still moralize indulgence. We still praise discipline. We still distrust overeagerness at the buffet. We still associate restraint with virtue. The language has softened, but the skeleton remains. Centuries ago, someone hesitated before taking a second slice of bread. Today, someone hesitates before dessert. The details differ. The psychology feels familiar. Because the medieval concern was never truly about bread. It was about control. Control over appetite. Control over desire. Control over the self in a world where so much was uncontrollable. Weather. War. Disease. Death. You could not command those. But you could pause before swallowing. You could choose to stop one bite early. You could leave a crumb on the plate. And in that small act, you felt mastery. Dinner, then, was dangerous not because it destroyed civilization. But because it offered pleasure in a fragile world. And pleasure, when fragile, feels powerful. Power requires guidance. Guidance requires rules. Rules create tension. And tension keeps societies alert. So tomorrow, the bell will ring again. Or the rooster will crow. Or the market will open. Bread will be baked. Fish will be salted. Cheese will be cut. And once again, someone will sit at a table in medieval Europe. They will lift a spoon. They will take a bite. And for a fleeting second, before judgment or gratitude or discipline arrives, they will simply taste. And that quiet moment, that unsupervised flicker of enjoyment, will remain the most dangerous thing in the room. Feast days deserve closer attention, because they complicate everything. If ordinary dinners were negotiations, feast days were carefully choreographed exceptions. On those mornings, kitchens stirred before dawn. Fires were fed generously. Knives sharpened with purpose. Dough rose in greater quantity than usual. Spices emerged from storage, cautiously, ceremonially. Meat was prepared in ways that would have felt extravagant on an ordinary Tuesday. But what made a feast safe was not abundance. It was permission. Permission reframed pleasure. When the calendar declared celebration, Christmas, Easter, a local saint's day, a wedding, enjoyment was no longer private indulgence. It became communal affirmation. Joy pointed outward, not inward. You were not enjoying for yourself alone. You were participating in something larger. That distinction mattered. Private pleasure suggested self-centered desire. Shared celebration suggested gratitude. So feast days were not loopholes in morality. They were demonstrations of ordered joy. But ordered joy required boundaries. Even at the most abundant table, excess could still draw raised eyebrows. Drunkenness, especially, crossed a line. Loud boasting. Mockery. Waste. Waste was particularly serious. In a world accustomed to scarcity, throwing away food was not only foolish. It was morally careless. To waste bread was to disregard labor. To waste meat was to disregard life. To waste wine was to disregard harvest. So even abundance carried responsibility. This is what makes medieval food culture fascinating. It was not simplistic repression. It was layered caution. Joy was allowed, but shaped. Hunger was expected, but moderated. Desire was acknowledged, but watched. Now let us look more closely at medieval diet science. The theory of humor shaped much of food morality. The body, they believed, was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Each associated with qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, and with temperaments. Food influenced these humors. Hot foods could inflame passion. Cold foods could dull the spirit. Dry foods might sharpen intellect but reduce vitality. Wet foods could soften both body and will. This was not metaphor to them. It was medical reasoning. So when meat was labeled hot, it was not simply about spice. It meant stimulating, energizing, potentially agitating. Fish, considered cold and wet, was calming but possibly weakening. Spices were hot and dry, medicinal in small quantities, destabilizing in excess. Cheese might be nourishing but thickening to the humors. White bread was easier to digest but perhaps too gentle. Dark bread was strengthening but heavy. Every ingredient carried character. And character, if mismanaged, could tilt personality. So food became preventative medicine for the soul. Eat too much heat, you risk anger or lust. Too much sweetness, you risk softness. Too much richness, you risk sloth. The table was a pharmacy as much as a dining surface. Parents applied this thinking to children. Children were believed to be naturally imbalanced, warm, moist, impulsive. Their diets were carefully considered to prevent further agitation. Too much sugar. Dangerous. Too much meat. Stimulating. Children needed structure at table not merely for manners, but for moral training. Sit straight. Wait your turn. Do not grab. Chew quietly. These rules were not only about politeness. They were rehearsal for self-control. A child who could wait for bread could later wait for greater responsibilities. A child who did not complain about plain porridge signaled resilience. So dinner doubled as education. The table was classroom. Now consider adolescence, a stage medieval writers often described as turbulent. Youthful bodies were considered especially hot-blooded. Which meant their diets required even more vigilance. Restricting certain foods was thought to temper excess energy. Food shaped behavior. Behavior shaped destiny. And destiny, in a worldview centered on salvation, was ultimate. So what might appear to modern eyes as obsession was, to them, stewardship. They believed appetite was a doorway. If unmanaged, it could widen toward other desires, ambition, sexuality, pride. If disciplined early, it could support humility and clarity. Which brings us to an interesting transition. As the medieval period slowly gave way to the Renaissance, subtle shifts began to occur. Trade expanded dramatically. New foods arrived from distant lands, eventually tomatoes, potatoes, chocolate. Sugar became more accessible. Urban centers grew. Wealth redistributed unevenly. As food diversity increased, so did culinary experimentation. Cookbooks began to circulate among elites. Presentation grew more elaborate. Art celebrated abundance more openly. The strict moral suspicion did not disappear overnight, but it softened in certain circles. Humanist thinkers emphasized worldly experience differently. Pleasure was not always framed as immediate spiritual danger. It could be appreciated as part of human richness. But the old tensions did not vanish. They adapted. Instead of framing indulgence purely as sin, some began framing it as imbalance. Health, not only holiness, became the focus. The language shifted slightly from salvation to well-being. And yet, echoes of the medieval voice lingered. Even today, when someone says, "I shouldn't have eaten that," there is a faint shadow of centuries-old reasoning. Not merely about calories. But about discipline. About deserving. About control. The medieval dinner table did not disappear. It evolved. Now let us return once more to the simple peasant cottage. Evening settles. The fire dims. A pot of pottage simmers gently. It is not luxurious. It is not heavily spiced. It is enough. A family gathers. Hands rough from labor. Faces tired but steady. They eat. Quietly at first. Then conversation resumes. Small jokes. Observations about weather. Speculation about market prices. Someone mentions the upcoming feast day. A child asks if there will be honey cakes. The mother smiles faintly. Perhaps. Perhaps not. Expectation is managed carefully. Hope must be proportioned like grain. Because too much anticipation magnifies disappointment. And disappointment magnifies longing. And longing, left unchecked, becomes dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction disrupts gratitude. So even hope is moderated. This is the subtle genius of medieval food culture. It trained emotional moderation through daily repetition. Not by eliminating pleasure, but by contextualizing it. Dinner was dangerous because it touched everything. Body. Soul. Class. Family. Medicine. Economics. Education. Identity. A simple bowl of stew carried all of that quietly within it. And so, night after night, across centuries, medieval Europeans returned to their tables with a mixture of hunger and awareness. They did not tremble in fear of bread. They did not collapse in guilt over cheese. They simply lived within a framework that treated appetite as meaningful. Perhaps that is the final truth. Dinner was dangerous because it mattered. Because it was one of the few daily experiences everyone shared, from peasant to king. And anything shared so widely becomes powerful. Power invites scrutiny. Scrutiny creates rules. Rules create tension. And tension, in their world, kept both body and soul alert. The bowl empties. The crumbs are brushed aside. The fire burns lower. Outside, wind moves through narrow streets or across open fields. Inside, stomachs are quiet for now. And somewhere in the stillness, there is a subtle balance. Not perfection. Not repression. but awareness. Tomorrow, hunger will return. And with it, the quiet negotiation. Between warmth and watchfulness. Between pleasure and prudence. Between the body that wants another spoonful. And the soul that gently asks it to wait. And that negotiation, repeated thousands of times across a lifetime, is why, in medieval Europe, the most dangerous thing was dinner. And yet, even after all of this, the rules, the calendars, the sermons, the humors, the feasts, the fasts, there remained something deeply human at the center of the medieval table. Hunger did not ask theological questions. It simply arrived. It arrived in the morning as a dull ache. It sharpened by midday. By evening it was persuasive. It did not care about liturgical nuance or the correct classification of eggs. It did not negotiate in Latin. It did not consult the calendar. It reminded you that you were alive. And that reminder was both gift and inconvenience. Because hunger made you dependent. On weather. On land. On labor. On community. On God. Dependency, in medieval thought, was not shameful. It was expected. Humans were not self-sustaining creatures, they were sustained. And food made that visible 3 times a day. You could not ignore it. You could ignore many things, political debates, distant wars, philosophical disputes, but you could not ignore the rumbling of your own body. Which meant appetite was one of the most honest forces in life. And honesty can be uncomfortable. Because appetite exposes limits. You cannot will yourself out of hunger indefinitely. You cannot pray it away. You cannot reason with it for long. Eventually, you must eat. And the moment you eat, you acknowledge need. Medieval spirituality revolved around acknowledging need for grace, need for mercy, need for forgiveness. So in a strange way, hunger mirrored theology. But satisfaction complicated the mirror. Because once hunger was quieted, even briefly, you felt stronger. More stable. Less fragile. And strength can tempt pride. So the system evolved not to erase hunger, but to keep its lessons fresh. Fasting reintroduced vulnerability. Plain meals reinforced humility. Communal eating reinforced shared dependence. Now consider something subtle, gratitude. Medieval people gave thanks before meals. Prayers were spoken. Blessings offered. Food was framed as provision, not entitlement. That framing softened danger. If you received food as gift, enjoyment became gratitude. If you received food as achievement alone, enjoyment risked pride. So the posture before eating mattered as much as the chewing itself. You bowed your head. You acknowledged the source. You remembered harvest cycles, divine providence, the chain of labor that brought bread to your table. Gratitude disciplined appetite gently. It reminded you that pleasure was not self-generated. It was allowed. This concept reshaped indulgence. To devour without thanks was crude. To savor with gratitude was acceptable, even beautiful. And here we see the nuance often missed. Medieval morality did not forbid pleasure. It required context. Pleasure detached from meaning was suspect. Pleasure anchored in gratitude could be holy. This is why harvest festivals felt different from random indulgence. When fields yielded well, communities gathered. Bread was fresh. Ale stronger. Meat more common. There was dancing. There was music. There was noise. But there was also thanksgiving. The joy pointed upward and outward. Not inward alone. That direction made it safe. Now let us look at table manners more closely. Manners were not trivial etiquette. They were visible theology. Do not grab. Do not eat before others are served. Do not speak with your mouth full. Do not lean greedily toward the platter. Do not wipe greasy fingers on your tunic. These rules enforced restraint and awareness of others. They slowed consumption. They inserted pauses. They made eating a social act, not an isolated one. If you reached too quickly, someone noticed. If you took the best piece without invitation, someone remembered. Community corrected appetite. And correction preserved order. Even how you cut meat mattered. Carving was skillful and symbolic. To carve poorly suggested lack of refinement. To carve selfishly suggested arrogance. To carve generously suggested nobility. The knife at table was not just utensil, it was instrument of hierarchy. And hierarchy was reinforced through serving order. At a noble table, rank dictated proximity to the lord and quality of food. At a peasant table, elders or heads of household might be served first. Children learned patience by watching. Patience at table trained patience in life. Now imagine the psychological weight of all this layered onto something as simple as bread. Bread was daily. Bread was sacred. It was central to religious ritual as well, which amplified its symbolism. To waste bread was unthinkable. To drop it invited immediate correction. Sometimes the fallen piece would be kissed before being set aside. Not superstition alone, reverence. Because bread embodied labor and divine provision. When you bit into bread, you bit into a network of meaning. Field to mill. Mill to oven. Oven to table. Table to body. Body to action. Action to destiny. Nothing was isolated. Now let us shift slightly to illness. During illness, food rules bent. The sick were allowed richer broths, extra dairy, even small indulgences. Why? Because survival trumped discipline. Health was prerequisite for spiritual life. A weakened body struggled to pray, to work, to serve. So sometimes the most virtuous act was to eat well. This flexibility reveals something important. Medieval food morality was not rigid cruelty. It was adaptive. Context always mattered. Intent mattered. Condition mattered. An elderly person might receive softer bread. A laborer might require more meat. A pregnant woman might be granted additional portions. Allowance did not equal indulgence. It meant responsibility. Food had to match need. Too little endangered survival. Too much endangered discipline. Balance lived in motion. Now, let us consider the seasons again, because seasonality shaped psychology. Spring brought scarcity. Winter stores thinned before new crops emerged. Hunger sharpened in that gap. Summer brought hope, green shoots, fresh herbs, lighter meals. Autumn brought abundance, harvest, storage, preservation. Winter brought conservation, dried, salted, smoked. These cycles trained patience. You did not expect strawberries in winter. You did not expect fresh fish inland without trade. Expectation matched reality, which moderated desire. Modern abundance often erases that rhythm. But medieval appetite rose and fell with the land. That natural fluctuation made satisfaction more vivid and more fleeting. When fresh apples appeared after months without fruit, the joy was genuine. But it was temporary. Everything was temporary. That awareness infused eating with urgency and restraint at once. Now picture again that quiet cottage at night. The bowls are scraped clean. The crumbs gathered. The table wiped. There is no refrigeration. No leftovers stored carelessly. Every scrap counts. The family lingers briefly. A final prayer. Thanks offered. Perhaps a story told. Then darkness thickens. Hunger is quiet for now. But not gone. Never gone. Tomorrow it returns. Reliable as sunrise. Persistent as breath. And with it returns the small daily choice. Will you eat in gratitude? In greed? In haste? Impatience? Will you leave something for another? Will you complain about simplicity? Will you boast about abundance? Will you notice the flavor and let it pass? Or cling to it? The answers are rarely dramatic. They are small, quiet, repeated. And over a lifetime, those small repetitions shape character. Which is why dinner, so ordinary, so daily, so universal, carried such weight. It was practice. Practice in humility. Practice in sharing. Practice in moderation. Practice in recognizing that pleasure is powerful and therefore must be handled gently. Not crushed. Not worshipped. Handled. Carefully. So as the centuries rolled forward, through plagues and reforms and discoveries and revolutions, that quiet lesson endured. The lesson that appetite is not enemy, nor master, but force. And force requires wisdom. In medieval Europe, they believed wisdom began at the table. With a bowl, a loaf, a knife, and a pause before the next bite. And perhaps, when we look back across those long wooden tables lit by firelight, we see not paranoia, not repression, but a society trying to understand something timeless. How to live in a body that wants things. How to enjoy without being ruled. How to eat without forgetting who you are. And that is why, more dangerous than war or plague, more persistent than invasion, more intimate than politics, the most dangerous thing in medieval Europe was dinner. And if we are going to continue honestly, we have to walk into the quieter, more extreme corners of this world. Because not everyone handled appetite gently. Some tried to conquer it completely. Beyond the ordinary rhythms of fasting and feast days, there were individuals who believed the safest relationship with food was distance. Not starvation, though sometimes it came close, but radical restraint. Certain ascetics, both men and women, reduced their diets to the barest necessities. Bread and water. Thin broth. Occasional herbs. Meals measured not by hunger but by endurance. For them, appetite was not just something to monitor. It was something to tame. They believed that the less power food held over them, the freer their souls became. If hunger could be endured calmly, then other desires could also be endured. If you could say no to bread, you could say no to pride. If you could ignore sweetness, you could ignore flattery. In this logic, appetite was training ground. But even here, the paradox remained. The more you focused on not eating, the more attention food commanded. To think constantly about resisting bread is still to think constantly about bread. So extreme fasting sometimes created the very obsession it hoped to dissolve. And the broader church often approached such extremes cautiously. Too much asceticism risked pride. To boast of surviving on crumbs was its own temptation. Humility, again, required balance. Which is why most medieval Christians lived somewhere between indulgence and renunciation. Now let us step into the marketplace. Because if the home and monastery were structured spaces, the market was dynamic. Stalls crowded narrow streets. Fish laid on crushed ice or damp cloth. Loaves stacked in uneven towers. Cheese wheels wrapped carefully. Spices measured in tiny, precious amounts. The market introduced choice. Choice complicated morality. At home, you ate what was prepared. At the market, you decided what to purchase. Decision introduces preference. Preference introduces desire. And desire requires judgment. A peasant walking past a stall of fine white bread might pause longer than necessary. A merchant might justify buying a richer cut of meat. A noble steward might negotiate aggressively over imported sugar. Each exchange carried subtle moral texture. Was the purchase necessary? Was it excessive? Was it fair? Food fraud added another layer. Bread sometimes contained fillers. Wine diluted beyond reason. Spices adulterated. Fish sold less fresh than advertised. Trust was essential. To sell dishonest food was not merely bad business, it was moral violation. You endangered health. You exploited hunger. You corrupted something sacredly ordinary. Which shows how deeply food intertwined with ethics. It was not trivial commerce. It was daily survival. Now imagine the year of plague. The Black Death sweeps through towns and villages. Labor collapses. Fields untended. Supply chains fracture. And something strange happens in the aftermath. With populations reduced, survivors sometimes find themselves with more access to resources than before. Meat becomes slightly more attainable for some. Wages shift. Land redistributes. Diet changes subtly. More protein. More variety. And with increased access comes renewed anxiety. If formerly scarce foods become common, what does that mean for social hierarchy? If peasants eat better, does order erode? So laws emerge, sumptuary laws, regulating who can wear what, and sometimes who can eat what. Food as marker of status is defended carefully. Because if everyone eats white bread loses meaning. Meaning, in medieval society, must be preserved. Thus dinner again becomes political. But there is another psychological shift after plague. When death feels close, pleasure can feel sharper. Survivors may lean more boldly into feast. Life is fragile. So joy becomes urgent. Which creates tension between restraint and celebration. You see this pattern in cycles throughout history. After catastrophe, appetite sometimes intensifies. Not from greed. From awareness of mortality. Medieval Europe experienced that tension repeatedly. War, famine, plague, followed by harvest, rebuilding, feast. The table bore witness to it all. Now let us slow again. Picture a mother breaking bread into smaller pieces than usual because stores are thin. She gives slightly larger portions to the youngest child. The father pretends not to notice his portion shrinking. The older sibling eats slowly, stretching each bite. This is not gluttony. This is strategy. Food reveals love as clearly as it reveals desire. To give up a portion quietly is virtue in motion. To complain about portion size is fracture in motion. And so even in scarcity, dinner teaches. It teaches generosity. It teaches endurance. It teaches awareness of others' hunger. Which reframes the entire narrative. Food was dangerous not only because it tempted individuals. It exposed relationships. Who do you feed first? Who goes without? Who receives the best cut? Who eats last? Hierarchy, yes, but also compassion. And now let us imagine something softer. A wedding feast in a small village. Tables pulled together outdoors. Bread piled high. Roasted meat turning slowly. Ale abundant. Music rising. Children chasing each other between benches. For this evening, caution relaxes slightly. Not erased. But softened. Because joy shared does not threaten unity, it strengthens it. The bride and groom eat first. Guests follow. There is laughter. There is noise. There are seconds. Perhaps even thirds. But tomorrow returns to moderation. Because celebration without rhythm becomes chaos. Rhythm preserves meaning. And rhythm depends on contrast. Which returns us to the heart of the matter. Dinner in medieval Europe was not dangerous because it was dramatic. It was dangerous because it was ordinary. It happened every day. It required choice every day. It presented temptation every day. It revealed character every day. War tests courage rarely. Plague tests faith unpredictably. Dinner tests discipline constantly. 3 times a day. For a lifetime. That is power. Now imagine the final years of an elderly villager. Teeth worn. Appetite smaller. Meals simpler. There is less struggle between excess and restraint. Hunger is softer now. Pleasure gentler. Perhaps there is more gratitude than tension. Because the battle has been rehearsed thousands of times. The spoon lifted. The bite taken. The pause. The swallow. The quiet internal question. Enough? Or more? And gradually, over decades, the question becomes less anxious. Not because food lost meaning. But because the person has learned its place. And that may be the quiet lesson medieval Europe tried to teach at its tables. Not fear of food. Not hatred of pleasure. But placement. Food belongs in life. Not above it. Not below it. Within it. Guided. Shared. Acknowledged. Respected. Because appetite is strong. But it is not destiny. It is signal. And how you answer that signal shapes you. So as night deepens over stone streets and wooden cottages. As fires dim and bowls are stacked. As crumbs are brushed from rough tables. The most dangerous thing in medieval Europe rests quietly in memory. A loaf of bread. A bowl of stew. A wedge of cheese. A spoonful of honey. And the invisible line between enjoying them. And being ruled by them. And tomorrow. That line will be drawn again. And crossed. And redrawn. As it always has been. Because hunger never leaves history. It simply waits for supper. And so the peasant sits at his table, which is not really a table but a plank resting on uneven supports, and he stares at the bowl in front of him as if it contains not stew, but judgment. The stew is thin. It is mostly barley and water. There are onions, because onions grow even when optimism does not. There is perhaps a fragment of salted meat if it is not a fasting day, and it is almost always a fasting day. The medieval calendar is crowded with prohibitions. Nearly half the year is marked by some form of abstinence. No meat on Fridays. No meat during Lent. No meat during Advent. No dairy during certain observances. No eggs. No animal fat. And so the body waits. It waits while the church reminds it that hunger is useful. That desire, when disciplined, becomes virtue. That the growling of the stomach is a kind of prayer. The peasant does not argue. He would not know how. He has been taught that the body is persuasive but not trustworthy. It wants warmth. It wants sleep. It wants pleasure. And pleasure, while not forbidden entirely, is suspicious. The danger is not in eating. Eating is necessary. Even monks eat. The danger is in enjoying it too much. A second helping might be reasonable. A third might be gluttony. And gluttony is not merely overeating. It is a disorder of the soul. It is not the quantity alone. It is the intention. Did you eat because you were hungry? Or because it tasted good? These are different things. The medieval mind divides actions into visible and invisible components. The visible act may be identical, lifting bread, chewing, swallowing. But the invisible motive transforms it. To eat with gratitude is holy. To eat with greed is perilous. And who can measure that difference? No scale exists for desire. So dinner becomes a quiet test. The bell rings in the monastery. The monks file into the refectory in silence. Their bowls are already prepared. Lentils. Cabbage. Bread so dense it resists enthusiasm. They sit. A single reader stands at a lectern and begins reciting from scripture or from the lives of the saints. The words float over the scraping of wooden spoons. No one speaks. To speak would imply distraction. To focus too much on taste would imply indulgence. The meal is nourishment, not entertainment. The saints are praised not for cooking well, but for fasting well. Some fast to the point of collapse. Some eat so little that observers marvel at their restraint. Stories circulate of holy women who live on nothing but the Eucharist. Of men who survive on herbs and water. Whether these stories are literal hardly matters. What matters is the direction of admiration. Restraint is impressive. Appetite is dangerous. In the marketplace, the smells are unbearable. Fresh bread. Roasted meat. Honey cakes. Spiced wine. The air is thick with temptation. Vendors shout prices. Children stare at pastries with the awe usually reserved for miracles. But even here, morality is present. There are sumptuary laws in some towns, regulations that restrict who may eat what. Certain foods belong to certain classes. White bread for the wealthy. Dark bread for the poor. Game for nobles. Offal for everyone else. Food is not just nutrition. It is hierarchy. To eat above your station is not just rude. It is destabilizing. Imagine a peasant feasting like a lord. The social order would wobble. So even pleasure must know its place. The nobility eat better, certainly. Roasted swan. Venison. Spices imported from distant lands at astonishing cost. Sugar, which arrives like powdered luxury. But they too are warned. Feasts are theatrical, but sermons follow. Confessors remind them that indulgence is temporary, and judgment is permanent. The body grows soft from excess. Softness suggests weakness. Weakness invites decay. A knight is expected to fight. To ride. To endure. Not to lounge in sweetness. So even at the high table, restraint is admired. A lord who eats modestly is praised for discipline. A lord who devours is whispered about. Gluttony is one of the 7 deadly sins for a reason. It is not dramatic like murder. It is not explosive like wrath. It is quiet. It happens daily. And that makes it more dangerous. Consider the idea of Lent. 40 days of denial. 40 days of remembering that Christ fasted in the wilderness. The wilderness is important. It represents absence. No comfort. No distraction. No feasting. To imitate that is to purify the will. But Lent also produces longing. And longing sharpens awareness. Every egg becomes symbolic. Every piece of cheese becomes a test. Markets shift to selling fish. Rivers become spiritually relevant. Entire economies reorganize around abstinence. When Easter finally arrives, the feast feels explosive. But even then, caution lingers. Joy is permitted. Excess is not. The medieval imagination often links food with other sins. Gluttony does not exist alone. It opens doors. Too much wine leads to loosened speech. Loosened speech leads to gossip. Gossip leads to envy. Envy leads to resentment. And resentment fractures communities. So the spoon in your hand is not innocent. It is connected to a chain of moral consequences. There is also the medical theory of humors. Food does not merely fill the stomach. It alters the balance of the body. Hot, cold, moist, dry, these qualities shape temperament. Eat too much hot food. And you become choleric. Eat too much cold food, and you grow sluggish. The body and soul are intertwined. Diet shapes personality. Personality shapes morality. So dinner is psychology. Dinner is theology. Dinner is medicine. Dinner is politics. Dinner is identity. It is never just dinner. In households across Europe, mothers teach children to eat slowly. To pray before and after. To thank God. To leave a little uneaten rather than scrape the bowl obsessively. Moderation is rehearsed daily. Not because food is evil, but because pleasure is powerful. And power must be managed. Meanwhile, famine waits in the background of history. Bad harvests are common. Weather is unpredictable. Storage fails. When famine comes, the moral narrative shifts. Suddenly, hunger is no longer voluntary discipline. It is catastrophe. And people pray not for restraint, but for bread. The irony is sharp. In times of abundance, hunger is virtuous. In times of scarcity, hunger is terror. The same empty stomach can be saintly or tragic depending on context. Now imagine a medieval person transported into a modern supermarket. Aisles of abundance. Meat every day. Sugar in everything. No fasting enforced by law. No priest monitoring your butter consumption. The medieval mind would not see convenience. It would see danger. Not because food is bad, but because unlimited choice is destabilizing. Desire without structure expands. And expansion, without discipline, feels spiritually risky. Back in the village, the peasant finishes his stew. He wipes the bowl with bread, carefully. He stands. He feels full. Fullness is pleasant. He hesitates. Is it too pleasant? He whispers a quiet thanks. He hopes gratitude outweighs enjoyment. Because the line between nourishment and indulgence is thin. And it is invisible. This is why dinner was more dangerous than war. War arrives loudly. Trumpets. Armor. Fire. Dinner arrives quietly. Steam. Bread. Salt. War tests courage. Dinner tests restraint. And restraint must be tested every single day. Not once. Not seasonally. Daily. The battlefield may be miles away. But the table is always near. And tomorrow, the bell will ring again. The bowl will be filled again. The same silent question will hover in the air. Are you eating to live? Or living to eat? And in that question, small and ordinary and repeated thousands of times across a lifetime, the medieval soul believes eternity may be decided. So the spoon pauses. And that pause, that small hesitation before the next bite, is where the real struggle happens. The pause does not last long. It cannot. The stew cools. The bread hardens. The body insists. But that flicker of hesitation, that brief awareness that even chewing has consequences, leaves a mark. It trains the mind to examine itself. Medieval spirituality is not loud. It is repetitive. Wake. Pray. Work. Eat. Pray. Sleep. Repeat for decades. And inside that repetition, meaning is carved slowly, like grooves worn into wood. A man who never reflects on his appetite is considered careless. A woman who never questions her satisfaction is thought inattentive. Self-examination is not optional. It is survival of the soul. There are manuals for confessors. Lists of questions. Have you eaten before others were served? Have you complained about the quality of your food? Have you sought out delicacies unnecessarily? Have you fasted when required? Have you broken a fast secretly? The specificity is striking. Sin is not abstract. It is logistical. It has timing, texture, quantity. It can hide in kitchens. Even cooking carries moral weight. Spices are debated. They are expensive, imported through long trade routes, symbols of wealth and reach. To cook with heavy spice might imply vanity, extravagance, pride. Sugar is particularly suspicious. It is dazzling, white, refined. It makes bland things thrilling. Thrill is not automatically virtuous. So the cook must navigate not only taste, but theology. How much honey is appropriate? When does sweetness become moral softness? There is no recipe book for that. In taverns, the line grows thinner. Ale flows more freely than water in many places. It is safer to drink. It is everyday. But it is also an entry point to excess. A cup is normal. 2 is social. 3 begins to tilt perception. The church does not forbid joy. But it mistrusts momentum. One pleasure easily invites another. So moderation is preached not because pleasure is evil, but because pleasure multiplies. And multiplication without restraint leads somewhere unpredictable. Yet, not everyone experiences this tension equally. There are mystics who speak of divine sweetness. They describe God as honey on the tongue. They compare spiritual ecstasy to a feast. Here, pleasure is not rejected. It is redirected. The appetite is not destroyed. It is retrained. Hunger for bread becomes hunger for holiness. Thirst for wine becomes thirst for grace. In this transformation, dinner becomes metaphor. Every bite is rehearsal for a greater longing. The Eucharist sits at the center of this paradox. Bread. Wine. Ordinary food. Declared extraordinary. It is consumed carefully, reverently, rarely for most lay people. It nourishes not the body, but the soul. And in that ritual, eating becomes sacred in the highest possible way. Which makes ordinary eating more complicated. If one meal can contain God, then all meals must be handled carefully. The act of swallowing is no longer neutral. It carries echoes. During great feasts, Christmas, Easter, harvest celebrations, communities gather and eat with visible joy. There is laughter. There is music. There are tables extended beyond their usual modest boundaries. But even then, sermons frame the celebration. Joy must be gratitude. Gratitude must be directed upward. Pleasure must acknowledge its source. Because unanchored pleasure feels dangerous. Like a boat untied from the dock. The medieval fear is not of flavor. It is of forgetfulness. To enjoy so deeply that one forgets limits. To consume without remembering mortality. To grow comfortable in a world that is temporary. Food is the easiest way to feel secure. A full pantry quiets anxiety. A heavy meal creates calm. But calm can become complacency. And complacency dulls vigilance. So the spoon returns to the bowl, but the mind stays alert. Fasting is often misunderstood as self-punishment. In many cases, it is strategy. If you occasionally deny yourself what you could easily take, you prove to yourself that you are not ruled by it. Control is demonstrated through absence. And absence sharpens identity. I can stop, the faster says. That sentence matters. Because if you cannot stop, then something else governs you. And in a culture obsessed with rightful order, kings above nobles, nobles above peasants, God above all, disorder within the self feels intolerable. The stomach must not rule the will. There are stories of monks who weep when they are forced to eat too much. Not because the food is bad. But because they fear attachment. Attachment to comfort weakens resolve. Resolve protects salvation. So the portion is measured. Sometimes painfully so. And yet, humanity persists. People laugh at meals. They savor soup. They sneak tastes while cooking. They trade recipes. They argue over who makes better bread. Life leaks through the cracks of discipline. The medieval world is not a gray wasteland of denial. It is textured. But the texture is threaded with caution. Pleasure exists, but it is observed carefully. Like a candle near dry straw. Beautiful. Potentially hazardous. When plague strikes, and bodies fall faster than crops can grow, appetite changes. Fear suppresses hunger. Or amplifies it. People eat urgently, uncertain if tomorrow exists. In crisis, restraint can feel irrelevant. Survival takes precedence. But when stability returns, moral order reasserts itself. And dinner resumes its quiet scrutiny. Generations pass this mindset along. Children learn that self-control is admirable. Stories reinforce it. Saints who fast. Kings who dine modestly. Villains who gorge. Literature exaggerates gluttony into grotesque caricature. A swollen belly becomes shorthand for corruption. Thinness becomes shorthand for discipline. The symbolism is powerful. Even without reading theology, one absorbs it. And so the medieval table becomes a training ground. Not for culinary excellence, but for character. Every meal is rehearsal. Every refusal strengthens identity. Every excess invites reflection. The battlefield may produce heroes. But the dining bench produces habits. And habits shape eternity. Imagine the silence after the meal. The bowls are empty. The crumbs are brushed away. The room is still. No applause. No visible victory. Just the quiet knowledge that you navigated another small test. No one writes songs about restrained dinners. No monuments commemorate moderate portions. But in the medieval imagination, these invisible choices accumulate. They stack quietly, day after day, like stones building an unseen structure. This is why dinner feels heavier than it appears. It carries invisible weight. Not because bread is wicked. Not because stew is treacherous. But because the human heart is easily persuaded. And persuasion happens most effectively through repetition. You fight a war once. You fight appetite daily. One requires armor. The other requires awareness. And awareness is exhausting. Night falls. The peasant lies on straw. His stomach is calm. Not overly full. Not painfully empty. Balanced. He folds his hands. He prays for forgiveness for what he might have overlooked. Perhaps he enjoyed the salt too much. Perhaps he wished for more. Perhaps he compared his portion to another's. These thoughts drift through his mind. Small. Ordinary. But not irrelevant. Because in his world, eternity is shaped by ordinary things. And tomorrow, when the bowl is set before him again, the question will return. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But persistently. Will you master your hunger? Or will it master you? And in that steady, unremarkable rhythm of spoon to mouth, the medieval soul believes the answer matters more than any trumpet of war. Morning arrives without ceremony. Light slips through narrow windows, touching wooden beams darkened by smoke and time. The house is cold. The ashes in the hearth are stirred back to life. Bread from yesterday is broken, not sliced, because slicing suggests delicacy and delicacy suggests preference. Preference is subtle. Preference implies ranking. Ranking implies attachment. And attachment is where things become complicated. The first meal of the day is small. It must be. Work waits in the fields, in workshops, in streets thick with mud and obligation. There is no indulgent breakfast. There is fuel. Fuel has a purpose. Purpose keeps pleasure contained. Yet even in containment, taste persists. The sharpness of cheese. The warmth of porridge. The faint sweetness of ale diluted with water. These are not neutral sensations. They move through the body and register in memory. Memory is powerful. The memory of a good meal can distract during prayer. It can soften resolve during fasts. It can create comparison, yesterday was better. Comparison quietly breeds dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction breeds restlessness. And restlessness is spiritually unstable. So gratitude is rehearsed again and again, not because food is rare in every moment, but because contentment must be actively maintained. In cities, guild halls host shared meals. Craftsmen gather under banners marked with symbols of their trade, shears, looms, hammers. They eat together, reinforcing identity. Community tempers appetite. When you eat alone, you can drift. When you eat together, you are observed. Observation curbs excess. Not always. But often. There is accountability in shared bread. To take too much is visible. To complain too loudly is remembered. And memory lingers longer than flavor. Royal courts are more theatrical. Tables stretch long under tapestries depicting hunts and battles. Servants move in choreographed patterns. Dishes arrive in courses designed not only to satisfy, but to impress. Presentation is power. A peacock roasted and reassembled with its feathers restored is not merely dinner. It is declaration. But even here, sermons whisper beneath spectacle. Chaplains remind kings that abundance is stewardship, not entitlement. That God watches not only the battlefield, but the banquet. A ruler unable to restrain himself at table may struggle to restrain himself in policy. Excess at dinner hints at excess elsewhere. Appetite reveals character. There are also those who choose radical simplicity. Hermits in forests. Anchorites sealed into small cells attached to churches. They reduce food to near absence. Bread and water. Sometimes less. They claim clarity emerges when hunger sharpens the senses. When the body quiets, the mind listens. To outsiders, it appears extreme. To them, it is liberation. By refusing pleasure, they neutralize its power. If you do not crave sweetness, sweetness cannot distract you. This is the logic. Whether sustainable or not is secondary. The symbolism matters. Festivals complicate everything. Carnival erupts before Lent. Excess is almost encouraged, briefly. Masks, meat, laughter, noise. It is a controlled explosion before controlled deprivation. The structure is intentional. If denial is coming, release pressure first. Yet even in celebration, there is awareness of the clock. Midnight approaches. Ash Wednesday waits. Ashes on foreheads replace grease on lips. The swing from abundance to austerity is dramatic. And drama reinforces lesson. Pleasure is temporary. Restraint is enduring. Travelers carry food that lasts, hard cheese, dried meat, coarse bread. Roads are uncertain. Inns vary in quality. Hospitality can be generous or minimal. Gratitude becomes practical. To reject food offered is insult. To demand more is arrogance. So the traveler learns adaptability. Adaptability is moral flexibility without moral compromise. Eat what is given. Do not crave what is absent. This becomes internal discipline. Medical advice circulates in manuscripts. Physicians recommend balance. Not too much red meat. Not too much fish. Not too many cold foods in winter. Not too many hot foods in summer. Diet influences temperament. Temperament influences behavior. Behavior influences salvation. The chain is logical, even if the science is imperfect. Food is preventative morality. Children observe adults carefully. If a father overeats, the lesson is noted. If a mother fasts faithfully, the lesson is noted. Example outweighs instruction. A household's tone at dinner imprints itself quietly. Is there gratitude? Is there complaint? Is there calm? Or is there grasping? These patterns outlast recipes. There is also shame. To be visibly greedy invites ridicule. Stories mock the glutton with exaggerated features, flushed cheeks, overflowing plates, insatiable appetite. Humor disciplines gently. No one wants to be the caricature. So self-restraint becomes socially reinforced. But beneath all structure, the body remains human. Hunger can be sharp. The smell of baking bread can weaken resolve. The sight of roasted meat can stir longing that feels almost involuntary. The medieval world does not deny biology. It attempts to order it. Ordering is different from erasing. The stomach growls. The mind responds. The response is what matters. In times of plenty, grain stores are full. Livestock thrive. Markets bustle. Confidence grows. Confidence can drift into pride. Pride whispers that provision is self-made. That skill alone filled the granary. And this is where dinner becomes theological again. To eat without remembering dependence is to risk arrogance. Hospitality can be generous or minimal. Gratitude becomes practical. To reject food offered is insult. To demand more is arrogance. So the traveler learns adaptability. Adaptability is moral flexibility without moral compromise. Eat what is given. Do not crave what is absent. This becomes internal discipline. Medical advice circulates in manuscripts. Physicians recommend balance. Not too much red meat. Not too much fish. Not too many cold foods in winter. Not too many hot foods in summer. Diet influences temperament. Temperament influences behavior. Behavior influences salvation. The chain is logical, even if the science is imperfect. Food is preventative morality. Children observe adults carefully. If a father overeats, the lesson is noted. If a mother fasts faithfully, the lesson is noted. Example outweighs instruction. A household's tone at dinner imprints itself quietly. Is there gratitude? Is there complaint? Is there calm? Or is there grasping? These patterns outlast recipes. There is also shame. To be visibly greedy invites ridicule. Stories mock the glutton with exaggerated features, flushed cheeks, overflowing plates, insatiable appetite. Humor disciplines gently. No one wants to be the caricature. So self-restraint becomes socially reinforced. But beneath all structure, the body remains human. Hunger can be sharp. The smell of baking bread can weaken resolve. The sight of roasted meat can stir longing that feels almost involuntary. The medieval world does not deny biology. It attempts to order it. Ordering is different from erasing. The stomach growls. The mind responds. The response is what matters. In times of plenty, grain stores are full. Livestock thrive. Markets bustle. Confidence grows. Confidence can drift into pride. Pride whispers that provision is self-made. That skill alone filled the granary. And this is where dinner becomes theological again. To eat without remembering dependence is to risk arrogance. So prayers before meals are not decorative. They are corrective. They redirect credit. Without rain, no harvest. Without harvest, no bread. Without bread, no debate about excess. Humility is built into the ritual. At night, monks sometimes dream of feasts. Dreams are involuntary. They wake uneasy. Even subconscious indulgence can feel revealing. What does the mind crave when not supervised? This question lingers. Confession absorbs it. Reflection softens it. The cycle continues. Over centuries, these patterns stabilize culture. Restraint becomes virtue. Moderation becomes admiration. Pleasure becomes something to handle carefully, like glass. Transparent. Beautiful. Breakable. And still, the simplest truth remains. People enjoy eating. They always have. They always will. The medieval difference lies not in absence of enjoyment, but in awareness of its weight. Every bite is small. But small things accumulate. Like drops of water shaping stone. A lifetime of moderate dinners forms a disciplined character. A lifetime of indulgence forms something else. Which one leads closer to salvation? The question echoes quietly across wooden tables and stone refectories, across cottages and castles alike. Dinner ends. The bowls empty. The candles dim. But the invisible ledger continues. Not of calories. Not of recipes. But of intention. And intention, in the medieval imagination, weighs more than any feast. So tomorrow, when the spoon rises again, the battle resumes. Silent. Ordinary. Unrecorded. And in that ordinariness lies its power. Winter makes everything sharper. Cold narrows attention. The wind presses against walls that were never meant to fully resist it. Firewood becomes precious. Salt becomes strategic. Meat, when available, is preserved carefully, because the season does not forgive waste. In winter, hunger feels closer. Not dramatic hunger, not always famine, but the steady awareness that stores must last. That each portion reduced today increases survival tomorrow. And in this tightening of supply, morality intensifies. To overeat in winter is not only indulgent. It is irresponsible. Responsibility is communal. One person's excess shortens another's security. So dinner is not private. It is economic. It is relational. It is shared survival. The head of the household often distributes food. Portions are observed. Children receive enough to grow. Workers receive enough to labor. The elderly receive enough to endure. Fairness is moral arithmetic. Too much to one, too little to another, imbalance appears. Imbalance in small things hints at imbalance in larger ones. Justice begins at the table. In monasteries during winter, fasting does not disappear, but it adapts. Discipline remains, yet practicality intervenes. The body cannot freeze for the sake of symbolism. There is always tension between ideal and necessity. The medieval mind understands compromise, but it frames it carefully. You do not abandon restraint. You adjust it with humility. Humility protects the intention. And intention, again, is everything. There are also those who fail. Those who sneak extra portions. Those who hoard. Those who drink too deeply in taverns to forget cold and fear. They are not monsters. They are human. And their humanity is familiar. Confession lines lengthen after feast days. Regret follows indulgence like a shadow. Not always dramatic regret. Sometimes mild. Sometimes almost routine. I ate more than I should. I drank beyond measure. The pattern is repetitive. Temptation. Excess. Reflection. Resolution. Attempt again. The cycle itself becomes instructive. Merchants who trade in food navigate another moral layer. Profit from hunger is delicate. To raise prices unfairly during scarcity invites outrage, not just social, but spiritual. Greed linked to necessity is harsher than greed linked to luxury. If you exploit appetite, you tamper with something sacred. Because hunger is universal. And universality demands fairness. Harvest festivals bring relief. Fields golden. Granaries swelling. For a moment, anxiety loosens. There is singing. Bread is abundant. Ale flows. Relief tastes sweeter than sugar. But gratitude must anchor it. Because harvest can fail next year. Memory of scarcity tempers celebration. It whispers caution beneath laughter. In literature and sermons, gluttony is sometimes described as the gateway sin. Not because eating is dramatic, but because it is constant. You can avoid theft by refusing opportunity. You can avoid violence by avoiding conflict. But you cannot avoid eating. Therefore, you cannot avoid the test. It repeats daily. relentlessly. And repetition ingrains habits deeper than occasional crises ever could. There is also gendered expectation. Women managing households are praised for thrift. To stretch flour wisely. To preserve meat effectively. To prevent waste. Wastefulness implies carelessness. Carelessness implies moral laxity. A well-managed kitchen reflects a well-ordered soul. Men, especially those in positions of power, are expected to demonstrate control publicly. To decline excess visibly. To show that authority includes self-mastery. Authority without self-mastery appears hollow. So the performance of moderation becomes important. Not false. But deliberate. Pilgrims on long journeys depend on hospitality. They eat what strangers offer. Hospitality itself becomes sacred. To feed the traveler is to enact mercy. But the traveler must also receive modestly. Demanding richer fare than offered is arrogance. Thus both giver and receiver navigate appetite carefully. Charity and humility meet over shared bread. There are moments when pleasure is openly embraced. Weddings. Birth celebrations. Victory returns. At these times, abundance is symbolic. It signals blessing. It signals continuity. It signals hope. Yet even in these moments, excess is monitored. Too wild a feast suggests loss of control. Control remains the quiet ideal. The medieval world lives close to consequences. Spoiled food means illness. Overindulgence means discomfort. Scarcity means weakness. The feedback loop is immediate. There is little insulation from results. Perhaps this proximity sharpens awareness. Perhaps it makes dinner feel heavier. Because the margin between enough and too much is narrow. And narrow margins demand attention. As centuries move forward, trade expands. Spices become slightly more accessible. Sugar spreads slowly. Coffee and chocolate wait on the horizon of future generations. But in the era we sit within now, sweetness is rare enough to remain symbolic. And symbolism intensifies scrutiny. The rarer the pleasure, the more carefully it is framed. Even the language of prayer reflects appetite. Give us this day our daily bread. Daily. Not weekly. Not in abundance beyond measure. Enough for today. Dependence is renewed every morning. Sufficiency is the goal. Not surplus. Surplus invites complacency. Complacency invites drift. Drift invites spiritual erosion. And so, over time, dinner becomes ritual without needing ceremony. The spoon lifted carefully. The bread broken deliberately. The wine sipped thoughtfully. No dramatic gestures. Just steady mindfulness. This is not paranoia. It is attentiveness shaped by belief that small acts matter infinitely. The modern observer might see anxiety. The medieval participant sees alignment. Body and soul synchronized. Appetite acknowledged but not enthroned. Pleasure tasted but not worshipped. Restraint practiced but not idolized. It is a balance constantly adjusted. Never perfect. Always attempted. In the quiet after the final bite, there is a strange dignity. Not triumph. Not pride. Just steadiness. You ate. You did not surrender. You did not deny your body entirely. You did not let it dominate. Balance, however fragile, was maintained. And tomorrow, the test returns. Not with trumpets. Not with banners. But with bread. And perhaps that is why dinner was more dangerous than war. War tests you once in chaos. Dinner tests you daily in calm. And calm, with its softness and subtlety, is where character is truly revealed. So the table remains. The bowl remains. The question remains. And as long as hunger exists, which is always, the quiet battle continues. Spring returns slowly. The ground softens. Markets brighten. Fresh greens replace the monotony of stored grain. After months of preservation and caution, the first tender shoots feel almost extravagant. Newness has a flavor. It tastes hopeful. But hope itself must be handled carefully. Too much optimism leads to carelessness. Plant too boldly. Spend too freely. Eat too confidently. The memory of failed harvests is never far enough away to permit complete relaxation. So even fresh lettuce, even herbs bright with life, enter the bowl under supervision of memory. Memory is the invisible guest at every medieval meal. The agricultural calendar shapes appetite. Plowing, sowing, harvesting, each phase adjusts what is available. Scarcity is seasonal, not constant. Abundance is temporary, not guaranteed. This rhythm trains expectation. You do not assume permanence. You assume fluctuation. And fluctuation teaches patience. If today is sparse, tomorrow may not be. If today is rich, tomorrow may thin. So you do not anchor your joy entirely in what is on your plate. You anchor it in something steadier. That is the goal, at least. There are jokes told at tables. Subtle ones. A neighbor teases another for eyeing the last piece of bread too long. Laughter diffuses tension. Humor polices excess gently. It allows correction without humiliation. You seem to love that pie more than your prayers, someone might say with a smile. The smile softens the warning. But the warning is heard. Markets expand in larger cities. Foreign traders arrive with unfamiliar ingredients. Almonds. Rice. Dried fruits from distant lands. The wealthy experiment cautiously. Novelty excites curiosity. Curiosity tempts desire. Desire, again, must be ordered. Trying something new is not wrong. Craving it obsessively is risky. So experimentation occurs within boundary. Exotic dishes appear at feasts, but moderation still frames them. There are also moments of sheer gratitude. After surviving illness. After surviving winter. After surviving childbirth. A family gathers and eats with deeper awareness. Every bite feels like mercy. In these moments, pleasure does not feel dangerous. It feels deserved. But even here, humility whispers. Life is fragile. This could vanish. So savor gently. The clergy preach against gluttony not because they hate food, but because they understand momentum. Habits expand quietly. Today an extra portion. Tomorrow a habit of seconds. Soon dissatisfaction with simple fare. Soon comparison with wealthier neighbors. Comparison breeds envy. Envy fractures peace. So discipline begins early, small, almost invisible. Time passes differently in a world without constant stimulation. Dinner is an event, even when simple. Candles lit. Family gathered. Work paused. It is one of the few daily pauses. And in pause, reflection naturally enters. How was the day? Was labor honest? Was speech kind? Food becomes backdrop to evaluation. You chew and consider your conduct. The meal is both nourishment and mirror. In noble households, tutors sometimes instruct young heirs on table manners with moral language. Do not grab.